Imagine standing next to a block of stone the size of a building, not carved into a wall somewhere far away, but sitting right there, fitted against its neighbours with a gap so tight you can't slide a credit card between them. No mortar holding it in place. No visible tool marks explaining how it got there. Just hundreds of tons of solid rock, resting exactly where someone put it thousands of years ago. And here's the part that should stop you cold. Whoever did this left no manual behind. No blueprint, no inscription that says, "Here's how we did it." Just the stones themselves, silent, massive, and somehow perfectly placed. We're talking about blocks that dwarf anything the Romans built. Blocks so heavy that modern engineers look at them and genuinely struggle to explain the logistics. Before Rome. Before Rome's roads, before Rome's aqueducts, before Rome's legendary engineering conquered half the known world. Someone else was already quarrying, moving and setting stones heavier than anything Roman hands would ever touch. So how did they do it? How do you cut a stone weighing as much as a fully loaded jumbo jet out of solid bedrock, using nothing but bronze tools, or maybe not even bronze? How do you drag it, roll it, or float it across miles of terrain without a single wheel breaking or a single rope snapping under that kind of weight? And once you've somehow gotten it there, how do you lift it, tilt it, and lower it into place with a precision that modern construction crews would envy, using cranes we're pretty sure didn't exist yet? This is the mystery we're diving into today, and I want to be upfront with you right from the start. Some of what we'll cover is backed by hard archaeological evidence, tool marks in quarries, calculations engineers have run and verified, dating methods that hold up under scrutiny. But some of it, the how exactly, the who exactly, remains genuinely debated. We're not here to hand you wild claims dressed up as fact. We're here to walk through what we actually know, what remains an open question, and why that open question has fascinated historians and engineers for over a century. Before we get into it, if you're listening to this while you're winding down, driving somewhere, or just letting your mind wander, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I love seeing these come in. Sydney at sunrise, Chicago at midnight, all reading the same mystery at completely different moments. It's honestly one of my favourite parts of doing this. And if you want to support the channel while getting the smoothest listening experience possible, follow us on Spotify. It's completely ad-free there, and it genuinely helps more than you'd think. If you've been enjoying these deep dives, a 5-star review goes a long way too. There's a link in the description for both. Alright, let's get into it. We're going to trace this mystery from the quarry floor, where these giants were first cut free, through the impossible logistics of moving them, to the moment they were lifted into place. And along the way, we'll ask the question nobody's fully answered yet. Who were the people capable of doing this before Rome ever picked up a chisel? Before we go any further, we need to get our terms straight, because words like megalith get thrown around constantly, and half the confusion around these ancient stones comes from people using the same words to mean different things. A megalith, at its most basic, just means a large stone used in construction, usually without mortar. That's it. The word comes from Greek mega for big, lithos for stone. Simple enough, but under that umbrella there are several distinct categories, and they matter more than you'd think. A monolith is a single stone, one continuous piece, not assembled from smaller parts. Think of an obelisk carved from one chunk of granite. An ashlar is a finely cut and finished stone block, usually squared off with precise edges, designed to fit tightly against its neighbours. Cyclopean masonry refers to walls built from massive, irregular stones fitted together so precisely that the gaps between them are nearly invisible, no mortar needed, no filler required. The name comes from ancient Greeks who looked at these walls and figured only the mythical one-eyed Cyclops could have lifted stones that heavy into place. And then there's the Trilithon, a structure made of two upright stones supporting a third stone laid horizontally across the top, like a stone doorway built for giants. Each of these terms describes something slightly different, and when you're trying to figure out what counts as the heaviest stone ever moved by ancient hands, the category you're talking about actually changes the answer. Now, how do researchers even figure out how much these things weigh in the first place? Nobody was standing there with a scale 3,000 years ago. So archaeologists and engineers work backward. They measure the block's dimensions, length, width, height, then calculate its volume. Once you know the volume, you multiply it by the density of the stone type. Granite, limestone, sandstone, whatever it happens to be, and that gives you an estimated mass. Sounds straightforward, right? Except stone isn't perfectly uniform. Density can vary within the same quarry depending on mineral composition and moisture content trapped in the rock over millennia. Blocks are rarely perfect rectangles. They've got irregular faces, rough undersides, sections that were never fully finished. So every weight estimate you hear comes with a margin of error built in. When you see a number like 800 tons or 1,000 tons, understand that it's usually a careful estimate, not a number pulled off a certified scale. Different research teams measuring the same block have sometimes come up with figures that differ by 50, 100, even 200 tons, simply based on where they measured and what density value they assumed for the stone. This is exactly why rankings of the heaviest stone in the world change depending on which source you're reading. One article will tell you a certain block in Lebanon holds the record. Another will point to something in Egypt. A third will bring up a stone in Japan or Peru or Bolivia. They're not necessarily wrong. They're just measuring different things or using different assumptions or comparing categories that shouldn't really be compared in the first place. And that brings us to a distinction that gets lost constantly in casual conversation, but matters enormously to anyone doing serious research. There's a difference between the largest stone ever quarried, meaning cut loose from bedrock but never moved anywhere, the largest stone ever transported, meaning actually dragged, rolled or floated some distance from its origin point, and the largest stone ever successfully set into a wall or structure, meaning lifted, positioned, and permanently placed as part of a finished building. These are three completely different engineering challenges. Quarrying a massive block requires precision cutting without shattering the stone. Transporting it requires solving friction, terrain, and structural stress over distance. Setting it requires lifting technology and positioning accuracy that has to work perfectly on the first try, because you're not getting a second attempt with something this heavy. A civilization could be brilliant at one of these three challenges and still fall short on another. So when someone claims a particular site holds the record for the heaviest stone, the honest follow-up question is always, heaviest at doing what exactly? This matters because it shapes everything we're about to explore. The stones sitting in Lebanon that we're about to dig into aren't just impressive because they're big. They're impressive because they represent success across multiple categories at once, quarried, moved, and in some cases, set with a level of precision that still puzzles engineers today. That combination is rare. Most ancient sites excel at one part of the puzzle. Very few nail all three, and here's why any of this matters beyond satisfying curiosity. Every civilization that came after, Rome included, built on knowledge that had to come from somewhere. If people before Rome were solving problems this complex, cutting, moving, and setting stones heavier than anything the Romans themselves would attempt, then the story of engineering history has a chapter we've been skipping. A chapter with no name attached to it yet. So let's go find out exactly where that chapter was written. If there's a missing chapter in engineering history, one of the places it was written is in the mountains of modern Lebanon. Baalbek sits in the northern Bekaa Valley, on a high plateau between two great ranges, not far from the sources of the Orontes and Litani rivers. In the ancient world, this was crossroads country. Caravans moving between the coast and the interior passed nearby. Armies marching from Egypt to Mesopotamia, and back again knew this route. And right there, slightly raised above the surrounding plain, is a rocky knoll that humans have been building on for thousands of years. Today, when people say Baalbek, they usually picture the Roman temple complex, soaring columns, elaborate capitals, grand staircases. The Temple of Jupiter, the Temple of Bacchus, the hexagonal forecourt, the monumental terraces. It's one of the largest sanctuaries the Romans ever built, a kind of stone manifesto declaring Rome's power to anyone who walked through its courtyards. But if you strip away the marble, the columns, the decorative facades, you're left with something else. A gigantic stone platform underneath it all. Massive retaining walls, foundations and substructures that the Romans inherited, modified and built on top of. And it's in those foundations that the story of heaviest stones really starts. At the western edge of the temple platform, buried in a colossal terrace wall, sit three blocks that have made Baalbek famous, the so-called Trilithon. Each one over 18 metres long, about 4 by 3.5 by 4 metres in section, stacked side by side like a row of stone train cars. Even on conservative estimates, we're talking hundreds of tons each. Above them, more huge blocks. Below them, older courses. And extending beyond the visible Roman work, hints of even earlier construction. This is where the debate begins. How much of that massive platform is truly Roman? How much is pre-Roman? And how far back does the earliest phase actually go? We know there was a sanctuary here before Rome. Classical authors mention a cult centre associated with Baal or Hadad, the storm god, and later with Helios, the sun. Archaeology has turned up material from the Hellenistic period, when the region lay under Seleucid and then local Illyrian control. Beneath that, there are traces that likely stretch back into the Iron Age and possibly the Late Bronze Age, pottery, small finds, structural remains that suggest a long history of sacred use. But the really big stones, the staggering megalithic courses, don't come with neat builders' inscriptions and dates carved on their faces. So researchers are left piecing together relative sequences. Which walls are bonded into, which, where masonry styles change, how later Roman work keys into earlier blocks. Some archaeologists argue that the entire West Terrace, including the Trilithon, was part of an ambitious Roman expansion, using techniques that push their engineering to the limit. Others see clear signs of an older, possibly Hellenistic, or even earlier platform that the Romans simply monumentalized, wrapping their temples around a pre-existing sacred core. And outside the main complex, down in the quarries, you find blocks even larger than the Trilithon, still attached to the bedrock or only partially undercut. Some of these monsters are almost certainly pre-Roman in intent, even if they were never moved. That raises an uncomfortable question: who exactly was planning to do something with a 1,000-plus ton stone before the High Imperial period? Baalbek isn't the only place where this kind of question pops up. All around the ancient Mediterranean and beyond, we see a pattern, later empires building on top of, around, or straight into the work of earlier stone traditions that were already old when the conquerors arrived. In the Levant, you have other sanctuaries with oversized stone platforms and retaining walls using huge ashlar blocks. Some of the Phoenician coastal cities show phases of construction with megalithic foundations that later Greek and Roman builders simply reused. On Malta, the Neolithic temple complexes, thousands of years older than Baalbek, are composed of enormous stone slabs shaped and positioned with uncanny precision. In the central Mediterranean, at places like Nurag Hasantu Antin in Sardinia, you find Cyclopean towers and walls that predate Roman arrival by many centuries. Head south to Egypt and the story continues. The Egyptians were the undisputed masters of large-scale stone from an early date. Old Kingdom pyramids sit on vast stone platforms. Valley temples incorporate colossal blocks weighing hundreds of tons. The unfinished obelisk of Aswan, still fused to the quarry floor, shows an attempt at a single stone that would have dwarfed almost anything ever erected. Had it not cracked during extraction, cross the Atlantic to the Andes, and you encounter another branch of the same puzzle, at Sacsayhuaman above Cusco, and in sites like Ollantaytambo, walls of interlocking polygonal blocks rise without mortar. Some stones tip the scales at over 100 tons, cut and fit so closely you can't slide a razor blade between them. The cultural context is completely different. No one thinks Roman engineers had anything to do with the Inca or their predecessors. Yet the technical problems they solved, quarry, move, fit, stabilize, are strikingly similar. Put all of this together, and you can see why Baalbek became the lightning rod. It sits at the meeting point of several traditions, near Eastern temple building, Hellenistic monumentalization, Roman imperial architecture. It has stones whose scale rivals anything in Egypt, and a platform design that at first glance feels more at home with Cyclopean walls in Greece or Peru than with typical Roman concrete and brick. Add in the fact that the heaviest blocks at Baalbek are partly embedded, partly obscured by later construction, and poorly documented in early excavations, and you have the perfect recipe for mystery. That ambiguity is what fuels unknown civilization narratives. If the Romans weren't routinely moving stones this big elsewhere, the argument goes, then someone before them must have had access to a lost kind of technology, a forgotten engineering tradition that appeared, accomplished the impossible, and vanished without a trace. Maybe. Or maybe what we're seeing is something less exotic but no less impressive, a continuum of stoneworking knowledge, regional techniques refined over centuries, and occasional bursts of ambition where a local ruler, a priesthood, or an empire decided to see just how far they could push the limits of mass and motion. To sort that out, we can't wave our hands and talk vaguely about ancients doing incredible things. We have to get specific, site by site, wall by wall, technique by technique. At Baalbek, that means asking, how were the quarries laid out? What tool marks do we see on the blocks? How do the joints between courses behave? Where do Roman construction methods clearly show up, and where do they stop? We're going to apply that same approach wherever we can. Compare Levantine masonry styles, Roman engineering manuals, Egyptian quarry scars, Andean ramps and causeways, and see what lines up. When you zoom in that far, fantastical explanations start to look less necessary, but the genuine mysteries become sharper, not softer. And as we move into the core of the Baalbek story, the Trilithon itself, the nearby stone of the pregnant woman, and the even larger blocks that were left in place, keep that broader context in mind. Baalbek isn't a one-off anomaly sitting alone in history. It's one dramatic peak in a whole mountain range of megalithic traditions. The real question isn't did aliens or an unknown super-civilization do this? It's what exactly were human engineers long before Rome already capable of? To answer that, we need to walk right up to the most famous stones in Baalbek and look at them as engineers, not just as awestruck tourists. Let's start with the Trilithon. Stand at the western edge of the temple platform, mentally peel away the later stones above, and you hit the line everyone talks about. The Trilithon is not a freestanding monument. It's not three standing stones like at Stonehenge. It's three gigantic limestone blocks locked into a retaining wall, halfway up a stepped foundation. They form one continuous course, sitting on top of slightly smaller but still massive blocks, and under yet another tier of heavy masonry. They're part of a structural sandwich, big on big on big. Each Trilithon block is roughly 19 metres long, about 4 metres high, and a little under 4 metres deep. To get a feel for that, imagine something the length of a city bus, but solid rock, as high as a 2-storey house, and thick enough that you could drive a car along its top. Then imagine 3 of those in a row set so closely that their vertical joints are almost razor thin. This is where the heaviest stones on Earth claim comes from. People see that size and ask, how much do they actually weigh? Here the numbers start to wobble. Weight estimates depend on 3 things: the exact dimensions, which are hard to measure perfectly because parts of the blocks are buried, the rock's density, which can vary within the same quarry, and how much of the block is really a single piece versus weathered or damaged surfaces. Early writers threw out dramatic figures: 1,200 tons, 1,500 tons, even more. Modern engineers, working from better surveys and rock samples, tend to come in lower. Most recent estimates for each Trilithon block fall somewhere between about 750 and 900 metric tons. Still outrageous, still heavier than almost anything else actually used in construction anywhere in the world, but not quite the fantasy numbers that show up on memes. That spread of maybe 750, maybe 900 is the measurement uncertainty talking. We don't have the luxury of pulling a block out, putting it on a scale and checking. So why on earth would anyone build with stones this big, especially in a retaining wall where nobody at ground level would really see them? The usual answers fall into 3 categories: structural, seismic, and symbolic. Structurally, a long, massive block spanning a section of wall acts a bit like a giant tie beam. It distributes loads evenly, presses down across a broader area, and resists differential settling between sections. Imagine building a terrace on a sloping knoll. Smaller blocks can shift independently, a few huge ones force the whole thing to move as a unit. That can actually make the platform more stable over centuries. Seismically, there's an argument, still debated, that big, well-seated stones can ride out earthquakes better than a pile of smaller units, as long as the foundation is sound. A huge block has a lot of inertia. Once it's locked in place by the courses above and below, it's harder for lateral shaking to dislodge it. The Near East is earthquake country. If you've got the capacity to move megaliths, it's not crazy to use that mass to your advantage. And then there's prestige. Monumental religion in the ancient world was always a competition in stone. Bigger platforms, higher columns, more impressive gates. Building with blocks that no neighbouring kingdom could even dream of moving sends a clear message. Our God is powerful, and so are we. Even if only priests and elite visitors ever got close enough to admire the Trilithon, its existence would feed stories, rumours, and awe. To understand how real and how human this all is, you have to look closely at what's actually there. The Trilithon blocks are not perfectly polished sci-fi slabs. Their exposed faces show evidence of dressing with hand tools, broad, shallow chisel marks, smoothed but still faintly visible under the patina. On some of the adjacent courses you can see quarrying techniques familiar from other Levantine and Roman sites. Channels cut around the outline of a block, faint lines where wedges were driven in to free it from the bedrock, bosses or small protrusions that may have been left for lifting and later shaved down. The joints between the 3 main blocks where they meet end to end are tight but not zero. There's no poured mortar in those vertical seams. The fit relies on the accuracy of the quarrying and the weight of the blocks themselves pressing them together. Along the horizontal bedding surfaces, where the Trilithon sits on the course below, there are slight irregularities. This isn't machine flatness. It's good, robust stone masonry maximising friction and interlock. Look at the overall alignment of the terrace, and another detail emerges. The Trilithon course is slightly set back, creating a kind of step in the wall. Higher courses retreat again. This stepped batter helps with stability. Each higher course sits a bit further in, moving the centre of mass toward the interior of the platform. It's a classic retaining wall strategy, just turned up to 11. All of that speaks of engineering logic. But the big arguments kick in when you ask a different set of questions. When were these particular stones put in place? By whom and in what order relative to the rest of the platform? One camp sees the Trilithon as an integral part of a grand Roman redesign. In this view, high imperial architects decided to expand an earlier sanctuary on a truly epic scale. They specified monster blocks where they thought they'd do the most good structurally and symbolically, and then deployed the full machinery of Roman engineering, teams of quarrymen, sledges, capstans, ramps to pull it off. Another camp points to differences in masonry technique between the Trilithon zone and clearly Roman sections, variations in tooling patterns, how the blocks are dressed at the edges, the way courses are bonded at the corners. They argue that the megalithic core may be older, perhaps Hellenistic or even pre-Hellenistic, and that Roman builders simply incorporated it, raising their temple on top of a platform whose sacred and practical value was already established. Even within each camp there are sub-theories. Some suggest a multi-phase project, an earlier platform begun with gigantic blocks but never finished, later revived and completed under Roman supervision. Others think the Trilithon represents a kind of prestige experiment, a single over-the-top course in an otherwise more conventional wall. There's also the question of purpose. Was this west terrace just a retaining wall for a level platform, or did it support some additional structure, a processional way, a monumental stair or forecourt, now lost under later construction? The stones don't come with labels. We infer function from geometry, from surviving parallels at other sites, and from the way later builders treated the platform as a sacred given rather than something to redesign from scratch. What's not in doubt is why the Trilithon became famous in the modern imagination. It concentrates the whole Baalbek mystery into one visible line. Here are blocks that push the limits of what we know ancient engineers could do. They sit at the intersection of multiple building traditions. Their exact date is contested. Their structural logic is clear. But the decisions behind their scale are still up for debate. To push further, we have to leave the wall and walk downhill into the quarries where these stones were born. Because if the Trilithon is impressive, the blocks they left behind in the rock are something else entirely. Walk a few hundred meters south of the Temple Hill, and the mood changes. You're no longer looking at finished, fitted masonry. You're standing in a scar in the landscape, an open wound of limestone where the mountain itself was turned into a construction site. This is where the Baalbek blocks came from, and right at the edge of that scar lies the celebrity of the quarry, the so-called stone of the pregnant woman. It's not standing, it's not even fully free. It's a gigantic rectangular block, still partly attached to the bedrock along its underside and one end, tilted slightly so that one long edge is buried and the opposite edge rises above the ground like the hull of a half-built ship. Locals have been clambering on it, telling stories about it, for centuries. Modern surveys put its weight somewhere around 1,000 to 1,050 metric tons, depending on how you reconstruct its buried parts. So larger than any of the Trilithon stones, and it never moved. Just beyond it, deeper in the same quarry, archaeologists found something even more extreme, an even larger monolith, roughly similar in form but with dimensions that push estimated weights into the 1,600–1,650 ton range. Again, still attached along its underside. Again, never transported, never set into any wall we know of. At some point, work simply stopped. Taken together, these half-freed giants do something important. They prove that whoever was running this quarry was aiming beyond the Trilithon. The 3 big blocks in the temple wall are not the high water mark of ambition, they're the successful examples. Here in the quarry, the dial is turned further into the realm of, let's see how far we can push this. Why carve blocks that you apparently can't use? One answer is, maybe they thought they could use them. The decision to abandon a monolith could have happened quite late in the process. Limestone is treacherous. As you cut down along the sides and undercut the base, internal flaws reveal themselves. A hairline crack can propagate across the block. A hidden seam or pocket of softer material can appear exactly where you need solidity. If you've invested months of labour into a single piece, you don't abandon it lightly. But if your master mason walks along the newly exposed surface, sees a structural fault, and decides it will fail under lifting stresses or when set into a wall, the safest call is to leave it where it lies. Another possibility is logistics. Maybe the quarry crews proved they could detach such a block, but the engineers studying the slope, the soil, and the available hauling gear realised that getting it the few hundred metres uphill to the platform was a different problem entirely. The stone of the pregnant woman, for example, sits in a shallow pit with bedrock under it, but softer material around it. To move it, you'd have to build a stable cradle or sled big enough to distribute that enormous load. Construct a ramp system capable of taking the weight without collapsing, and organise pulling teams or mechanical devices powerful enough to overcome the friction. At some point, the math may simply have stopped working. Then there's the human factor that never shows up in neat engineering diagrams. Changing plans, changing patrons, changing politics. Mega-projects in antiquity, just like today, depended on the will and resources of rulers. A king dies. A governor is recalled. Funding is diverted to a war or to a different temple. The quarrymen keep working for a while on the last approved design. Then the orders slow, then they stop. A half-cut monolith can be the fossil of a cancelled idea. If you look closely at the surfaces of these quarry blocks, you get a sense of how that work was actually organised. The sides of the stone of the pregnant woman are not perfectly crisp machine edges. They're stepped and striated, showing horizontal and vertical bands where different crews or work phases operated. You can see parallel chisel marks running in consistent directions, suggesting teams assigned to specific faces, each with its own rhythm. In some areas there are narrow trenches, quarry channels, cut down along the intended outline of the block. The classic technique used throughout the Near East: define the perimeter, deepen the slot, gradually isolate the stone. Along the lower edges, where the block is closest to freedom, you sometimes find shallow sockets and wedge marks. These are the ghost traces of the final separation technique, inserting wooden or metal wedges, hammering them in to create stress, sometimes soaking wooden wedges so they expand and widen the crack, slowly prying the block up from the mother rock. It's not a mysterious laser process. It's labour-intensive, methodical and familiar from many other sites. The unfinished surfaces also tell you about hierarchy and sequencing. The lower, soon-to-be hidden faces are rougher. Tool marks are broader, more hurried. The upper and outward faces show finer dressing, where stonemasons were already beginning to refine the visible parts even before the block was fully detached. That implies a clear division of labour: rough-out crews, finishers, supervisors, coordinating side by side. You're looking at an industrial operation, not a one-off miracle. Now connect the quarry to the platform, and the picture sharpens even more. Between the two lie gentle slopes and natural saddles in the terrain, the most likely transport routes. Archaeologists and engineers have traced hypothetical pathways where sledges or rollers could have been dragged uphill with the least resistance, often aligning with areas where later roads and paths run. When you model the slope angles, soil conditions and friction coefficients for wood on earth or stone on wood, the Trilithon-sized blocks fall into the realm of brutally hard but technically solvable problems. The pregnant woman and the even bigger monolith do not. They push the system to a breaking point. This is where the quarry evidence acts as a kind of reality check on some of the more extravagant claims. The fact that such huge blocks were carved but never installed tells you ancient builders were experimenting at the edge of their capability, not casually tossing 1,000-ton pieces around like Lego bricks. At the same time, their methods, those quarry channels, chisel fields, wedge lines, are recognisably human, rooted in the same tool traditions you see from Egypt to Anatolia. It also hints at how knowledge was transmitted. You don't wake up one day and decide to attempt a 1,600-ton monolith without having already mastered 100-ton and 500-ton stones. The quarry is a record of incremental learning, of scaling up, failing, adjusting, and sometimes stopping when reality bites back. From here, the obvious question is, given those tools and those constraints, how exactly did they free and control blocks of even just 800 or 900 tons? To answer that, we have to zoom in on the cutting itself, the moment when rock stops being mountain and becomes stone. Imagine you're standing beside that half-freed giant and you hit rewind. The block fuses back into the hillside. Tool marks smooth out, wedges vanish, channels close. You're back at the beginning when this was just bedrock and intention. How do you go from solid mountain to an almost detached 1,000-ton rectangle with nothing more than hand tools, animal power, and patience? The first move is almost always the same. Whether you're in Lebanon, Egypt, or a Roman quarry in Italy, you draw the outline. A master mason or engineer walks the rock surface, picks the orientation, and stakes out a rectangle the size of a modest house. The choice is strategic. You want the stone's internal bedding planes to run in directions that won't cause it to shear when it's lifted. You want maximum soundness, minimum flaws. He taps, listens, reads subtle changes in colour and grain, the way a doctor reads a pulse. Once the block is laid out, crews begin trenching. Along the marked perimeter, they cut narrow channels down into the rock, quarry trenches, maybe a handspan or two wide. In the earliest phases of stoneworking in the Levant, that cutting would have been done with stone hammers and picks made from harder rocks like dolerite or basalt, pounding and bruising the limestone away in flakes. By the Bronze Age, metal appears. First copper alloys, then bronze chisels and picks. Later still, in the Persian, Hellenistic and Roman periods, you get iron and then steel tools, far tougher, able to hold sharper edges, slicing into rock rather than merely battering it. You can actually track some of this evolution across the region. Egyptian Old Kingdom quarries show pounding basins and pecked surfaces from stone hammers. Later Pharaonic and Near Eastern sites start to show the narrower, more regular grooves characteristic of metal chisels. At Baalbek, the tool marks look like they belong squarely in that world. Chisel fields, not just pounded pits. With chisels and picks, crews deepen those perimeter trenches, working in teams. One worker swings a hammer, the other holds the chisel and calls the rhythm. Chips fly. Over days and weeks the channels descend, sometimes to depths of a metre or more, isolating the sides of the future block. But vertical trenches only get you 3 walls of a box. The truly nerve-wracking part is the undercut. To free the base, quarrymen extend short horizontal galleries under the block from the side trenches, or they open longitudinal channels along the long faces and gradually nibble under the mass. This is where control matters. Undercut too much, too early, and the stone can sag and crack. Undercut unevenly and stresses concentrate in one corner. So they do it in stages. First, you cut a shallower bed under the block, testing the rock as you go. Then, along the edges where the block is nearly free, you start inserting wedges to create and guide the final fracture. There are two main wedge strategies that crop up again and again in ancient quarries. One uses hard wedges, stone, metal, or a combination. Quarrymen carve a line of small, evenly spaced holes or notches along the intended break line, then drive in tapered wedges with hammers. Each wedge alone does almost nothing, but collectively they introduce a controlled line of tension across the stone. Keep tightening, keep tapping, and at some point you hear it, a dull crack running along the bed. The other strategy uses water and wood. Workers cut a series of narrow slots, then pound in dry wooden wedges. Once they're seated, the wedges are soaked. Wood swells with remarkable force as it absorbs water. That expansion exerts pressure on the stone from within, again encouraging a fracture to propagate along the line you've prepared. This method is especially effective in more brittle rocks, but it can work in limestones as well, especially when combined with prior chiselling. Neither method is fast. You're talking about multiple rounds of cutting, seating, wetting or hammering, checking, recutting. The goal isn't to blast the block free in an instant. It's to persuade the rock, millimetre by millimetre, to give you a clean, predictable parting plane rather than a wild, jagged break. At the scale of a door lintel, that's delicate work. At the scale of a 20-metre monolith, it's borderline insane. But nothing about it requires lost technology. What it does require is time and people. One of the quiet myths that hovers around Baalbek is the idea that these blocks must have been quarried too fast for manual labour, that the precision and size imply some kind of machine that can saw and lift in hours or days. The logistics don't support that. If you model a quarry crew of a few dozen workers, say 30 to 50 men on a single massive block, you're looking at months, maybe a couple of years of on and off attention to get from raw bedrock to a fully detached monolith. That's entirely in line with what we know from other ancient megaprojects. Egyptian obelisks could take seasons to carve. Massive Roman columns were sometimes left half-finished for years when priorities shifted. And crucially, when you stretch the project out over that kind of time frame, the manpower requirements stop looking supernatural. A city the size of Roman Heliopolis could easily spare a rotating labour force of a few hundred quarrymen, carters, and support staff for a prestige temple. Even a smaller, earlier sanctuary could, over decades, invest steady labour into a slow-burn platform expansion. We also need to remember the quarry is just one part of a much larger ecosystem of work. While specialists are deepening trenches and setting wedges, other teams are dressing faces, sharpening tools, cutting smaller blocks, preparing ramps, and maintaining roads. The notion that hundreds of giant stones were magically popped out of the earth in a single phase, and then hauled overnight collapses under the weight of basic scheduling. So how do we actually know which of these techniques they used here at this quarry for these blocks? Some evidence is right in front of us. Those little wedge marks along the edges, the uniform spacing of notches in some trenches, the texture of chisel fields that match other Near Eastern sites where tools are better preserved. In a few places you can trace faint drill and split sequences, shallow depressions where pointed tools repeatedly struck to initiate a fracture. What we don't have, at least not yet, are the toolkits themselves in secure, datable contexts directly tied to the giant monoliths. No stash of chisels clearly abandoned mid-project. No preserved wooden wedges in situ under a block. Iron corrodes. Wood rots. Modern disturbances from later building to looting to simple erosion blur the archaeological layers. We also lack detailed microanalysis across every surface. Modern methods, 3D scanning, microscopic wear studies, even residue analysis can in principle distinguish between different cutting regimes, stone hammering versus copper chiseling versus iron tools. Some of that work has been started at sites around the Mediterranean, but Baalbek still has gaps. If a future excavation turned up, for example, a workshop trench at the edge of the quarry with discarded chisels, sharpening stones, and slag from ironworking locked beneath a layer we can date securely, that would tighten the picture considerably. Likewise, finding preserved wedge fragments in untouched separation grooves would settle debates about exactly how the final lift was initiated. Until then, we're stitching together a best fit model from comparative sites and the scars on the rock. What those scars consistently show is not impossibility, but a ruthless, almost patient pragmatism. Define, isolate, undercut, wedge, and only then dare to move the beast. Which brings us to the next step, and in some ways the most staggering. Once you've convinced 1,000 tons of limestone to stop being mountain, how do you get it to cooperate on the journey uphill? Once the block is free, the physics bill comes due, because now you're not dealing with geology anymore. You're dealing with friction. 1,000 tons sitting on bare ground doesn't want to go anywhere. To budget, you have two basic choices: reduce the friction under it, or dramatically increase the pulling power in front of it. Every serious transport theory is just some combination of those two levers. The simplest, oldest trick is the sledge. Instead of trying to roll the stone itself, you put it on something that slides better than raw rock. A heavy wooden frame or cradle, built up like a giant pallet with runners underneath. Across the ancient world, that's exactly what we see. Egyptian tomb art shows colossi and obelisks on sledges, pulled by teams of men. Assyrian reliefs show statues moved the same way. Later, Roman engineers described timber platforms carrying monumental loads, winched along prepared ways. The logic is brutal but elegant. A sledge concentrates the stone's weight across a wider, smoother surface. That alone can lower the coefficient of friction. Now add a second step. You deliberately engineer the ground under it. People imagine these things dragged over random dirt and boulders. That's a recipe for snapped beams and shattered corners. What ancient builders actually did when the stakes were high was build roads. They levelled paths. They filled low spots with rubble, compacted them, laid down layers of gravel and tamped earth. In some cases they added wooden planks or stone paving. Even a few centimetres of controlled surface makes an enormous difference, especially for a load that can't tolerate twisting. Then comes lubrication. The Egyptians drew little jars being poured in front of sled runners. For a long time people thought that was some kind of ritual scene. Then physicists tested it. Add the right amount of water to sand, you change its behaviour. The sand grains lock together into a firmer matrix, lowering ploughing resistance and allowing the sledge to ride higher instead of digging in. Oils, animal fat or clay slurries can do something similar on rock or timber, create a thin film that reduces direct contact. At Baalbek's scale, a big limestone block on a stout wooden sledge, dragged over a compacted, possibly partly paved route, with teams constantly wetting or greasing the path. That's one plausible baseline scenario. Not magic, just ugly, repetitive labour. Rollers are the other crowd favourite, but they're trickier than people think. Lay a row of logs, put your load on top, and as the stone moves, men in the back keep grabbing freed rollers and running them around to the front. In principle, this can dramatically cut friction. In practice, it can also create instability. Rollers want to squirm and slip on slopes. They concentrate load at single contact lines. Under 1,000 tons, any irregularity, a knot, a flat spot, a hollow in the ground, translates into sudden jolts. That doesn't mean rollers were never used. For smaller megaliths, or as part of a hybrid system under a sledge, They make sense. But with something like the stone of the pregnant woman, most engineers who've modelled the problem quietly step back towards sledges, hard-packed tracks, and very cautious gradients. And gradients are everything. On level ground, you might get away with a relatively modest pulling force, especially if your friction is under control. Add just a few degrees of slope, and the math changes violently. A 1-degree incline doesn't sound like much, but over tens of meters, it means the weight is constantly trying to roll or slide backward. Your pullers are now fighting gravity as well as friction. Flip it the other way, downhill, and the problem gets even scarier. Once a multi-hundred-ton sledge starts to accelerate, you're not moving a stone anymore. You're riding a runaway projectile, stopping it without snapping ropes, shattering the block, or wiping out the crew requires brakes, chocks, and terrifying confidence. That's why proposed transport routes for Baalbek's Megaliths that involve sharp slopes, tight corners, or rough gullies look less and less credible the more you stare at them. Even a few % grade has to be carefully managed. Stepped ramps, side chocks, dragging anchors, ropes run through fixed points so the load can be lowered under control instead of just let go. So where does the pulling muscle actually come from? People first. In almost every pre-industrial transport scene we have, human traction is the baseline. Rows of workers on ropes, chanting, stepping in rhythm. A fit adult can contribute maybe a few tens of kilograms of pull for prolonged periods, more in short bursts. Multiply that by hundreds of workers on multiple ropes, and you're in the right ballpark to overcome static friction on a well-prepared track. Animals help, but not always in the way people imagine. Oxen and draft animals are great for steady pulling, but they're less useful when you need precise stop-start control on a crowded worksite. There's also the simple problem of space. Yoke too many animals in front of a narrow sledge, and they start tripping over each other and the prepared road. This is where mechanical advantage comes in. Capstans, winches, and simple pulley systems let you trade distance for force. Instead of 100 men hauling directly on one rope, you might have teams walking in circles around vertical posts, winding ropes that tether the sledge. The Romans absolutely used this for moving heavy stones, and nothing about the technology is beyond earlier Near Eastern builders. A vertical post set in a pit, a wooden drum, rope, some stakes to anchor the whole thing. That's it. Combine several in sequence, and you can ratchet a block along a route. Tension, move a little, secure, reset. Cross-cultural analogues point in the same direction, without proving any specific case. Egyptians with wetted sand and sledges, Assyrians with rollers under carved bulls, Romans with capstans and stone-paved haul roads, later medieval builders stacking all of the above for cathedral bells and monoliths. The particular recipes differ, but the menu is familiar. Reduce friction, control the path, multiply force, and never ever let the load do anything you didn't plan. And through all of this, the most terrifying variable isn't just getting the block moving. It's keeping it from tipping. A monolith is not a neat cube. The long, thin Baalbek stones have a high centre of mass relative to their footprint. If your track crowns slightly in the middle, the sledge can rock. If one runner rides up on a stone or a roller shifts, you introduce a tilt. A few degrees is tolerable, go past a certain point, and the entire system can lurch sideways. 1,000 tons tipping is not a recoverable mistake. There is no try again. The stone will crack or bury itself. The project can die in a single bad moment. So ancient haulers had to think in 3 dimensions. They weren't just planning a line on a map, they were smoothing camber, managing drainage so their route didn't turn into mud, checking every support beam, rehearsing how to stop or reverse under stress. They probably used cribbing, temporary stacks of smaller stones or timbers, slid under the load as it advanced, so that even if something failed, the drop would be limited. When you start adding this up, the roads, the lubrication, the manpower, the traction systems, the obsession with small slopes and stability, you stop seeing an impossible task and start seeing an engineering culture that was very, very good at bullying physics within tight margins. It also puts their ambition in perspective. Hauling a 300-ton block is a nightmare, but still within the realm of what we've seen replicated in experimental archaeology. Hauling 800 or 1,000 tons? That's where the numbers start to scream. Not it couldn't be done, but you need either extraordinary patience or some clever trick we haven't fully reconstructed yet. And remember, the journey doesn't end when the block arrives at the building site. Somehow, that stone still has to be raised, aligned, and nested with others to millimetre tolerances. Getting it there was only half the miracle. The next problem is even more nerve-wracking. How do you lift a mountain fragment into place without letting gravity win? So imagine you've inched this monster block across the landscape, white-knuckled the whole way, and now it's sitting roughly where the wall or podium needs it. It's still at ground level. The stones it has to sit on are not. This is where the fantasy images of gigantic wooden cranes swinging 1,000-ton blocks into the air drift in, and where the physics taps you on the shoulder again. Real Roman cranes are brilliantly documented. Vitruvius describes them, reliefs show them, archaeology gives us anchor holes and hardware. A good treadwheel crane with compound pulleys could probably lift in the 6-10-ton range routinely, maybe a few dozen tons if you throw everything at it, brace the frame insanely well, and accept a terrifying safety margin. That's impressive. It's also nowhere near the advertised weights of Baalbek's largest blocks. So, if you can't simply hook a cable around a 700-ton stone and hoist, what do? You stop thinking in terms of lifting and start thinking in terms of raising. Incremental, controlled, slow. One of the oldest tricks in heavy engineering is cribbing. You don't pick the load up in one go. You jack it up a little, then immediately build the ground up under it. Picture this as a kind of ratchet. You lever one side of the stone up a few centimetres, using long wooden beams as pry bars, fulcrums set in pits or on blocks. While the edge is slightly airborne, workers slam in wedges and stack timbers. Lower the stone, it settles on the new, higher support. Move to the other side. Repeat. Over hours, days, weeks, the entire block can be walked upward, layer by layer, sitting on an ever-growing crib of timbers or small stones. When a crib gets too high or unstable, you can fill under it with packed rubble or earth, consolidating it into a ramp. And that's the other major move. Instead of lifting the stone to the wall, you bring the ground up to the stone. Earthen ramps are cheap, strong, and infinitely adjustable. You don't have to invent a machine that can take the whole load in tension. You just re-sculpt the landscape into something that can carry it in compression. At Baalbek or similar sites, one common reconstruction goes like this. While the podium courses are going up, you're simultaneously dumping rubble and earth against the outer face, building a massive sloping berm. Each new course of big stones is dragged, cribbed up a little, the ramp packed and extended, the process repeated. By the time you're ready for a top course, the ground level outside might literally be up at that height. Now the stone isn't hanging in midair at all, it's sliding along a prepared surface just a little higher than where it will end up. You're still fighting friction, but you've dodged the crane problem entirely. That still leaves the question of precision. Even on a ramp, how do you nudge hundreds of tons into a seat line so tight you sometimes can't slide a sheet of paper between the joints? Here again, it's about never facing the whole problem at once. Under extreme loads, materials behave differently. A block that would feel welded to the ground under static conditions might shift a few millimeters at a time if you control just where and how the contact happens. One technique is controlled rolling on sacrificial elements. You can set stout hardwood rollers or even rounded stone eggs in shallow grooves on top of the course below. The block rests on just a few of these, concentrating the load. With crowbars under its edges, teams can rock it minutely, advancing it one roller diameter at a time. As each roller pops out the back, it's run to the front. You're not trying to move it meters now. You're trying to move it centimeters, just enough to get the faces to line up. Another is sand leveling. Instead of trying to hew the underlying course to absolute perfection, you deliberately leave a shallow depression or stack small spaces, then pour in sand or fine gravel. The new block is eased down onto that granular cushion. The weight gradually forces the grains to rearrange, flowing from high spots to low spots. Builders can tap and pry while this is happening, encouraging the stone to settle into the best possible position. It's the same principle as setting a heavy flagstone in a bed of sand today. The result, once the grains finish compacting, is a remarkably close-fitting joint, even if neither surface was machined flat in a modern sense. Small wedges and shims do the rest. Limestone or hardwood wedges can be driven under the block's edges as it comes off its temporary supports. Tap a wedge. The stone tips a fraction of a degree. Pull one out. It sinks that tiny amount. By orchestrating dozens of these, workers can tweak tilt and horizontal position, almost like dialing in a safe combination. Once everything is perfect, the shims can be left in place, buried in the joint, or gradually removed as the stone fully bears onto the course beneath. Over years and centuries, gravity helps. The sheer mass means any micro-irregularities at the contact surfaces get crushed, abraded, or creep under load. The joint tightens as asperities are worn down and dust or fine debris fills microscopic voids. From the outside, this can look like impossible machining. In reality, it's patient fit-up plus time. None of this means cranes were useless. For the smaller, though still impressive, blocks around Baalbek's podium, Roman-style lifting devices make perfect sense, hoisting from quarry to cart, setting architraves, fine-tuning placement. We even see typical rectangular lifting bosses left on stones, meant to be trimmed off later once the hooks and clamps were no longer needed. But every crane has a ceiling. Once you push past a few dozen tons, timber strength, rope tension, anchoring, and human safety start screaming at you. The solutions that make most sense for the truly colossal blocks are the low-tech, high-mass ones: ramps, cribbing, shims, small levers used many times instead of one giant lift done once. Hidden inside these methods is something subtle and easy to miss. You don't need supernatural precision in your tools if you have an almost obsessive willingness to iterate. Lever, wedge, check. Lever, wedge, check. Thousands of micro moves, each within human strength, adding up to a final position measured in millimeters. And while we don't have an instruction manual from Baalbek's builders, we do have experiments. Modern crews using nothing but wood, stone and earth to raise and place multi-ton blocks with astonishing control. They're not working at Baalbek's full scale, but they're proving a principle. Precision is the product of feedback loops, not miracle machines. If you're enjoying this deep dive into how ancient builders actually bullied physics, and you want more mysteries like this in one place, there's a 12 Mysteries book linked on our website, with a discount for viewers. Check the link in the description later on. It pulls together cases just like Baalbek from all over the world and walks through the possibilities without resorting to aliens did it. For now, though, we've been quietly dodging one of the biggest questions. Even if we can sketch out credible ways to move and raise these stones, when exactly were the largest ones at Baalbek set in place. Are we really looking at something pre-Roman here, or did Roman engineers inherit the job halfway through? To answer that, we have to talk about one of the least glamorous, most misunderstood parts of archaeology. Figuring out when something happened when the main thing you're staring at is a giant mute block of stone. Stone itself is terrible for dating. There's no carved in 15 BC isotopic timer slowly ticking inside the block. Once a limestone or granite boulder has formed in the ground, its internal chemistry barely changes in a way we can tie to a specific human event. You can sometimes get formation ages or dates for when the stone was last heated, but that's geology time, not construction time. So archaeologists mostly don't try to date the stone. They date what's around it. The first big tool is stratigraphy, layers. If you cut a trench against a wall, you're looking at a cross-section of time. The lowest undisturbed layers are older, the higher ones are younger. If a massive foundation block is clearly sitting in a trench that was cut through earlier layers, and that trench is filled with backfill containing pottery, coins, or organic material, you can radiocarbon date. You suddenly have a bracket. This wall can't be older than the youngest stuff in the fill. At Baalbek and at other huge stone platforms, that's one of the main clues. Where archaeologists can get to the foundations, they look for intact stratigraphy pressed up against the masonry. If Roman period sherds are in the soil that butts right against the big blocks, that's a strong hint you're not dealing with a Bronze Age mystery podium. Then there are construction seams. Masonry is like handwriting. The way stones are dressed, the way joints are laid out, the way corners are bonded, these all form styles that change through time. On a big platform you can sometimes literally trace boundaries where one building phase stops and another starts. A change in block size, in tooling marks, in the type of mortar or clamps used. At Baalbek, the podium under the Temple of Jupiter is a patchwork. You have more regular, relatively modest blocks in places, very Roman in their proportions and layout. Then you have the giant courses of the so-called Trilithon, and the even bigger still in quarry monsters nearby. These aren't smoothly blended together. There are joints, transitions, spots where later work abuts earlier courses. Those seams are where arguments start. One camp says, this is all Roman initiative. They point to tool marks on the stones that match known Roman techniques, to clamp holes of familiar shapes, to lifting bosses that look just like those on undisputed Roman projects. They note that the Grand Temple of Jupiter is very much a Roman imperial cult project, and that Roman sources talk about a massive temple complex here, with construction and embellishment stretching from the time of Augustus onward. From that perspective, the story is fairly clean. Roman engineers design a colossal platform, maybe inspired by earlier local sanctuaries, and then throw every trick they know at the problem. Some elements get finished, some, like the largest quarry blocks, are abandoned when plans change or funding dies. The scale is extreme, but the cultural context and the engineering fingerprints look Roman. The other camp says, slow down. Just because Romans were there and added their temple on top doesn't mean they authored every stone. They point out that ancient Near Eastern cultures were building big stone platforms and Cyclopean terraces long before Rome existed. They highlight places where the lowest or outermost courses at Baalbek look cruder, more weathered, or stylistically different from the neat Roman entablatures above. They argue that the Romans may have found a pre-existing venerated high place, a local sanctuary, possibly with substantial stonework already in place, and decided to enlarge and regularize it. On this view, the Trilithon and its neighbours might represent an earlier Levantine or Hellenistic phase that Romans then built over and into, much like they did at plenty of other pagan holy sites across the empire. So what do we actually know? Most specialists are comfortable saying that the visible temple complex, the columns, the decorative architecture, the main podium as a functioning sanctuary, belongs solidly in the Roman period. The inscriptions, the stylistic details, the historical texts all line up with that. Nobody's seriously arguing that the big Corinthian columns are secretly Bronze Age. The deeper you go, the fuzzier it gets. Evidence for a pre-Roman sacred site at Baalbek is strong, textual hints from later classical authors, scattered earlier finds, the broader pattern of Levantine religion where important cult sites often sit on the same spot for many centuries. But tying specific courses of giant masonry to that earlier phase is much harder. We don't have an inscription carved into a Trilithon block saying dedicated under King so-and-so, 3rd century BC. We have patterns, analogies, and technical details that can be read in more than one way. One scenario, probably the most cautious, is that Baalbek is a classic example of a multi-phase building project stretched over centuries. Start with a local hill sanctuary, maybe with modest stone terraces. Add a Hellenistic or early Roman podium expansion using large but manageable blocks. Then in the high Roman imperial period, someone with serious ambition decides to supersize the whole thing, planning those gigantic foundation courses and starting to quarry truly outrageous stones. Some of that mega phase gets completed, like the Trilithon, in place. Some remains half-finished in the quarry. Later emperors tweak, repair, or abandon parts of the plan. In that model, Roman and pre-Roman aren't clean boxes. You get continuity. Old foundations reused, extended, and dramatized. Earlier sacredness wrapped in newer, flashier architecture. What's widely accepted is the late Roman identity of the standing temple and its use. What's contested is how far down that Roman story goes and whether the very largest blocks are the culmination of Roman ambition or the inherited bones of an even older regional tradition that Rome simply absorbed and amplified. And that question, who actually kicked off this style of super heavy building in the region, takes us to the next piece of the puzzle. If it wasn't an unknown lost civilization, then who were the people and cultures most likely to have laid the first giant stones? If we're not going to wave our hands and say mystery race lost in the mists of time, then we have to do the harder thing. Look at the actual cultures who lived there, had the tools, the manpower, and the religious motivations to move absurd amounts of stone. And in the Levant, that list is not short. You've got Bronze Age city-states tied into the great powers of Egypt and Mesopotamia. You've got the Iron Age Aramean and Canaanite kingdoms. Later, the Phoenician cities on the coast, fabulously wealthy from trade. Then, Achaemenid Persian rule, Hellenistic dynasties after Alexander, and early Roman control before the big imperial temple projects kick in. Any one of those periods could, in theory, have seen a major sanctuary at a place like Baalbek. We know that by the late Iron Age and into the Classical period, Levantine elites were perfectly capable of mobilizing massive labor. This wasn't a world of isolated villages. It was full of heavily fortified towns, palace complexes, monumental gateways, and big terraced platforms supporting temples. Look at places like Byblos, Sidon, or Tyre on the coast. These were Phoenician powerhouses with advanced shipbuilding, long-distance trade networks, and serious stoneworking chops. Inland we see cities building high podiums and stepped terraces to create artificial mountains for their gods. The idea of a raised, walled precinct as a place where heaven and earth meet is very old in this region. So, when you ask, who could realistically have started a giant podium at Baalbek before the Romans? The answer is lots of people. Phoenicians and their Levantine cousins are especially interesting here. Their sacred precincts often combined practical stone engineering with deep religious conservatism. Temples and high places were not casual projects. They were anchored in myth and ritual. Once a spot became associated with a deity like Baal, Hadad, or a local storm god, you didn't just erase it and start fresh somewhere else. You rebuilt, you enlarged, you refaced, but you kept the place. Archaeologists see this layering all over the Near East. A small early shrine becomes a larger temple. The old foundation gets encased in newer masonry. A new dynasty adds a colonnade, a portico, a stone-paved forecourt. Centuries later, when another empire takes over, they scrape away the top decoration, carve their own inscriptions, maybe rotate the orientation a few degrees, but the basic sacred footprint stays the same. So the idea that the Romans came to Baalbek, saw a long revered local high place, and said, "Yeah, this is where Jupiter lives now, let's turn it up to 11, fits a well-known pattern." They did similar things in North Africa, in Gaul, in Britain. Old Celtic sanctuaries get Romanized, ancient Libyan or Berber cult sites get wrapped in Roman architecture. You end up with hybrid complexes, Roman columns rising from platforms whose earliest stones were laid by people who never heard the word Roman in their lives. This is where unknown civilization talk can be both understandable and misleading. From the outside, when you see massive weathered blocks under fresher, more decorative architecture, it's tempting to split them in your head. New stuff belongs to known history. Big rough stuff must be something else. Something older, deeper, lost. But the more you look at the Eastern Mediterranean, the more you see continuity rather than clean breaks. Techniques move forward in time even when literacy doesn't. Stonecutters learn from older stonecutters. A master mason in 200 BC doesn't have to write a manual on how to dress a block or lay a dry joint. He shows his apprentices. They, in turn, train the next generation. The tradition lives in muscle memory, in rules of thumb, in shared shop lore that never touches a clay tablet or a scroll. Empires fall, quarrymen keep going to work. You don't need a sprawling bureaucracy to pull big stones from a hillside. You need access to land, enough surplus food to feed workers, and a religious or political reason to justify the effort. Small kingdoms or allied city-states could absolutely pull that off when the payoff was a prestige temple. And remember, written records in this region are patchy. We have rich archives from some places and times, almost nothing from others. Fires, invasions, damp climates, all of that eats documents but leaves stone. So on the ground, what you see is a stepped platform, a Cyclopean terrace, a few reused blocks in later walls. The archive that would tell you King so-and-so commissioned this foundation, year X, might have been on perishable material in a palace that burned 3,000 years ago. Into that silence the human brain rushes to fill the gap. Lost civilizations are a satisfying story. They explain the impressive without forcing us to grapple with the idea that normal, documented cultures, people with the same messy politics and incremental skills as everyone else, could just steadily, stubbornly get good at moving stone. The risk is that once you label something unknown, you stop looking for connections. You stop asking how Phoenician trade wealth, Assyrian imperial pressure, Persian administration, and Hellenistic architectural taste might all have intersected at highland sanctuaries. You overlook the way a site could have been sacred to a Canaanite storm god, then to a Hellenistic Zeus, then to Roman Jupiter, all underpinned by the same evolving platform of stone. A better way to think about it is this. Instead of a single lost civilization, imagine a long relay race of cultures. Bronze Age builders lay the first modest terraces. Iron Age elites expand them. Phoenician and Hellenistic masons refine quarrying and lifting techniques, pushing block sizes bigger when prestige demands it. Romans arrive with more money, more manpower, and a taste for the colossal, and they inherit every trick that worked, plus their own innovations. No one group has to be superhuman. The continuity is the superpower. Skills can leap across languages, religions, and dynasties without ever appearing as neat lines in a history book. Quarry scars, half-finished blocks, and mismatched masonry courses are the fingerprints of that process. So when we ask, if not unknown, then who? The most honest answer is a chain of very known cultures stacked in time, each leaving their lair on a sacred hill that never stopped mattering. And once you look at Baalbek that way, another question opens up. Were these colossal stones really unique, or part of a broader regional habit of building with blocks so big they look impossible? They weren't. Once you zoom out from Baalbek and stop treating it as a one-off anomaly, you start seeing echoes of that. How is that even possible? Stonework scattered all around the Mediterranean. Head west across the sea into central Italy. Long before the Romans perfected their clean, rectangular stone blocks and concrete vaults, someone was stacking enormous, irregular boulders into walls, so tight you can't slip a knife blade between them. Places like Alatri, Norba, Ferentino, Segni, and the so-called Cyclopean walls around the Acropolis of Cosa. Up in the hills you find fortifications made of blocks the size of cars, fitted together in crazy polygonal patterns, 5, 6, 7-sided faces, no mortar, just weight and friction locking everything into place. If you showed those walls to someone who'd only ever seen standard Roman ashlar, those neat Lego-like rectangles, they'd probably say the same thing people say about Baalbek. Different style. Must be a different lost builder. But style isn't just an artistic whim. It's an engineering response to what you've got to work with. Those Italian polygonal walls are built in regions where the local stone, often limestone or tuff, breaks in big, chunky masses rather than splitting cleanly into long rectangular blocks. You can try to force it into standard ashlars, but you'll waste a ton of material and labour, or you can lean into its natural fracture pattern. That's what polygonal masonry does. You take big, roughly blocky pieces as they come out of the quarry or hillside, knock off the worst protrusions, then patiently carve and peck the contact surfaces so each block keys into the next. Think 3D jigsaw puzzle made of half-ton stones. On the other side of the Aegean in Greece and the wider Mycenaean world, you see another version of the same logic. At Mycenae and Tiryns, the famous Cyclopean walls around the citadels use huge, rough limestone blocks piled into thick defensive rings. They're not as insanely precise as Baalbek's Trilithon or the Italian polygonese, but the principle is familiar: big stones, minimal shaping, dry joints, stability through sheer mass. Then in other Greek sites, even in the same regions, you see crisp ashlar, rows of carefully squared blocks, horizontal courses, everything lined up like graph paper. Polygonal versus ashlar looks at first glance like two totally different worlds. In reality, they're just two ends of a spectrum. Ashlar is what you get when the local rock cooperates, when it splits predictably, when you have the iron tools and the time to shape every face into right angles. It's great for temples, colonnades, any architecture where regularity and symmetry are part of the visual message. Polygonal and Cyclopean styles make sense when the stone comes in irregular masses. You care more about brute stability than visual order. You want to use fewer joints because you're worried about earthquakes or wall battering, or you're building on a slope and need a retaining wall that can flex a little without failing. In other words, the style tells you about geology, available tools, and the job the wall is supposed to do. That job varied. Some of these big block constructions are clearly fortifications. The hilltop circuits at Mycenae or Alatri are all about defence. Thick, high walls, limited gates, commanding views of the surrounding valleys. If you're expecting siege engines or just worried about your angry neighbours, putting up a wall of multi-ton stones is a very convincing way of saying, good luck with that. In other places, the same techniques get used for terraces. Think of the agricultural and temple terraces around Greek and Italic hill sanctuaries. Before you can build a shrine on a steep slope, you have to create a flat platform that won't slide away in the first heavy rain. Massive retaining walls, sometimes polygonal, sometimes big ashlar, hold back tons of soil, turning a jagged ridge into a level courtyard. At Delphi, at Pergamon, at countless smaller sites you see this logic. First the earthworks and stone terraces, then the pretty columns and sculptures on top. The wow factor for visitors isn't just the temple. It's the impossible-looking platform clinging to the mountainside. And then there's status architecture. Big blocks signal power. If you can marshal the labour to carve and drag multi-ton stones, it says something about your control over resources. Elite families and city-states knew this. Using outsized blocks in gates, podiums or foundations was a way of flexing in stone. We can do what our neighbours can't. The same basic motivations echo from Baalbek to central Italy to Bronze Age Greece. Defence, terracing, sacred platforms and political display. Different cultures, different gods, similar engineering problems. Once you line these examples up, the impossible starts to look less like an alien intervention and more like a set of convergent solutions. Give a community a hillside they want to tame, a quarry full of stubborn rock that breaks into big chunks, simple iron or even bronze tools, ropes, levers, sledges, and plenty of human muscle, and a religious or political reason to build something that will outlast them. They will figure out ways to move, fit, and stack stone that look impossible from a distance. That's the key shift in perspective. Instead of asking, how could they possibly have done this? As if stonework this bold requires a vanished super-civilization, you ask. What constraints were they working under that made this design the best available option? Suddenly, polygonal walls stop being mysterious relics of Cyclopean and become rational responses to geology and risk. Ashlar stops being a magical Roman flourish and becomes the natural outcome of better tools, more regular stone, and a taste for visual order. If you enjoy this kind of deep dive into how real constraints shape ancient mysteries, I've collected 12 of the most intriguing cases, from megaliths to lost cities, in a book you can grab through the link on the website. There's a discount running right now. Details are in the description. Because once you start seeing Baalbek as part of a whole family of big block engineering, another question emerges. If this kind of know-how was so widespread, why does it sometimes seem to appear, peak, and then vanish, leaving later builders apparently forgetting what their ancestors could do? To really test whether Baalbek and those Italian and Greek walls are part of some lost global system, you have to look at places where we actually know a lot about who built what, when, and how. Egypt is the best starting point. There you have something Baalbek doesn't give us directly: paperwork. On the Giza Plateau, and at places like Deir el Medina, you find quarry marks, workers' graffiti, payroll records, bread and beer ration lists, even the occasional "we were here" joke scrawled in red ink inside the stones. You get named work gangs, the Friends of Khufu, the Drunkards of Menkore, leaving their signatures on blocks that will never see daylight again. You also see the logistics laid bare. Quarries up the Nile, channels cut for transport, ramps and causeways designed to drag and lever multi-ton blocks into place. In some tomb scenes, you literally get cartoons of teams hauling colossal statues on sledges, a guy up front pouring water on the sand to reduce friction, overseers with sticks making sure nobody slacks off. Is every detail of pyramid construction solved? No. Egyptology still debates ramp shapes, exact lifting sequences, and how they coordinated such massive projects over decades. But the broad picture is clear. No magic tools, no super metals, no need for a missing civilization, just stone that fractures predictably, copper and later bronze tools, wooden sledges, ropes, levers, and tens of thousands of organised workers managed by a brutally efficient state. When you put Baalbek next to Giza, the similarities jump out. In both cases you have nearby quarries, carefully planned logistics, monumental platforms designed as statements of power, and blocks so big that the main challenge isn't, can we shape this? But can we move and place this without killing everyone involved? The difference is documentation. Egypt leaves you a paper trail. Baalbek leaves you mostly stone. Head to the other side of the planet, and you meet a different branch of the same problem, the Andes. At places like Cyclopean above Cusco, Ollantaytambo in the Sacred Valley, and the precincts around Cusco itself, you see some of the most mind-bending stone fitting on Earth. Giant andesite and diorite blocks, some weighing dozens of tons, shaped into elaborate polygons, faces with gentle curves, interlocking offsets so that one stone keys into another in 3 dimensions, joints so tight that for centuries people have repeated the line about you can't fit a knife blade between them. But here the engineering logic shifts from how do we drag heavy things to how do we make sure the city doesn't fall down every time the ground moves. The central Andes are violently seismic. Massive earthquakes hit the region again and again. Spanish-built colonial churches and palaces with regular mortar-bound stonework cracked and toppled. The old Inca foundations they sat on, often still standing. That's not magic, that's design. Polygonal Inca walls are slightly battered, leaning inward. The blocks are irregular, but their centres of mass are pulled inward, and the joints are designed so that when the wall shakes, the stones can wiggle and settle without popping apart. Fewer continuous vertical joints means fewer clean break lines. The huge lower courses act like shock absorbers. Compare that to Giza or Baalbek. Those are in regions where earthquake risk is lower, and the primary concerns are vertical load and long-term settlement. There, using enormous relatively regular blocks in long horizontal courses makes sense. Stability through mass and friction. Different continents, different cultures, different toolkits. Very similar headline problem. We want this thing to stay put for a very long time. This is where convergent engineering comes in. In biology, convergence is when unrelated species evolve similar traits because they're solving similar problems, like wings in birds and bats or streamlined bodies in dolphins and sharks. In engineering, you see the same thing. Give humans gravity, stone that obeys certain fracture mechanics, muscle power, levers, ropes, and maybe simple wheeled or sled transport that need to resist earthquakes, erosion, and time, and they will, sooner or later, stumble onto a similar toolbox. Big blocks where you can manage them, polygonal fits where stone comes out irregular, battered walls in quake zones, stepped or terraced foundations on slopes. You don't need a single master culture teaching everyone else. You just need physics being consistent everywhere. That doesn't mean long-distance contact never happened. The ancient Mediterranean absolutely was a web of exchange. The Near East, Egypt, and the Aegean borrowed and adapted from each other constantly. There's clear evidence for idea diffusion in scripts, religious iconography, ship design, and maybe even some construction tricks. But when people jump from these walls look alike to there must have been a global stoneworking civilization, they're skipping several crucial steps. If we wanted to seriously argue that, say, Inca stonemasons and Levantine builders shared direct technical knowledge, we'd need more than visual similarity. We'd need artifacts, old-world tools, materials, or inscriptions in securely dated Andean contexts, or vice versa. Genetics, clear, pre-Columbian gene flow markers between relevant populations that can't be explained by older migrations. Linguistics, loanwords for very specific technical concepts crossing oceanic and cultural boundaries in timeframes that make sense. Transitional sites, intermediate locations showing hybrid techniques and materials that trace an actual path of contact. Chronology that lines up, a plausible window when both traditions were active and capable of interacting. So far, that evidence isn't there. The Andes developed their megalithic peak long after the great old world megalithic waves in the Mediterranean and Levant. The ocean between is not a casual afternoon sail. All lines of hard data, archaeology, genetics, linguistics, support independent development. That doesn't make the parallels less astonishing. In some ways, it makes them more impressive. Because it means that under similar constraints, human ingenuity tends to cluster around similar answers. That's what we're seeing when we line up Baalbek, Giza, Sacsayhuaman, and those Italian hilltop walls. Big stones, tight joints, massive platforms, earthquake-aware geometry. Not fingerprints of a lost global order, but signatures of convergent problem-solving. Where this gets really interesting is not just in the similarities, but in the divergences. Egypt pushes toward neat rectangular courses and internal spaces, pyramids, hypostyle halls. The Andes develop terraces, zigzag walls, and organic-looking facades that ripple along the terrain. The Levant and Rome go for towering podiums and hard-edged temple platforms like Baalbek. Same physics, different aesthetics, different political stories being told in stone. And that brings us back to the puzzle we left hanging. If so many cultures could independently work out how to cut, move, and place massive stones with such precision, why does the know-how sometimes seem to flare up, peak, and then fade, as if somebody hit delete on the instruction manual? Because in a way, somebody did. Not a single villain with a torch in the Royal Library, but a long chain of disasters, budget cuts, conquests, and very boring administrative decisions that, step by step, make it impossible to keep doing the thing your ancestors were so good at. Take any large-scale stone project. Behind those blocks you have a political system that can command thousands of workers, an economy that can feed them while they're not farming, specialists who know the quarries, the tools, the tricks, apprentices learning from those specialists over decades. All of that has to survive for the knowledge to survive. So imagine the opposite. The kingdom that commissioned the giant platform goes through a civil war. Tax revenues crash, roads aren't safe, grain shipments don't arrive. Suddenly the king, or the new guy who killed the king, has a different priority. Soldiers, not stones. That means no one is funding massive temple platforms anymore. Quarry gangs get dissolved. Foremen who know exactly how many oxen you need for a 300-ton block are reassigned to repairing city walls, or they just go home. Now add a couple of bad harvests. Craftsmen and labourers die or scatter. Apprenticeship chains snap. 10 years later, most of the last generation who actually supervised a mega block move are either old, dead, or living in someone else's kingdom. The oral instruction manual was in their heads, and their heads are gone. That's how skills vanish. Not because people get dumber, but because the ecosystem that made those skills useful and teachable breaks down. You see this even in much better documented periods. After the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, palace economies across the eastern Mediterranean fell apart. Literacy plummeted. Monumental building programs stopped for centuries. The Greeks, who eventually came out of their Dark Age, looked back at Mycenaean ruins and told stories about giants and cyclopes. The walls were literally older than their institutions of memory. Something similar can happen on a smaller scale with every regime change. Conquerors don't just inherit skilled workers, they repurpose them. The people who built one dynasty's temple might be put to work building the next dynasty's fortress, or repairing roads, or quarrying smaller blocks because the new rulers prefer brick and concrete. The know-how doesn't vanish overnight. It gets diluted. If you're a specialist stonecutter, and the new administration tells you, "We're done with 800-ton vanity projects. We're mass-producing mid-sized blocks and bricks now," you adapt. Your children grow up learning the new standard, not the old extremes. In 2 or 3 generations, the memory of "we once moved a block the size of a house" is a family legend, not a living practice. And then there's assimilation. History is full of cases where the actual builders get absorbed into a new political package, and their work is retroactively rebranded. Romans take over an older sanctuary. They don't put up a big plaque saying, "Shout out to those anonymous locals who did the really hard part centuries ago." They rebuild the upper temple, slap imperial inscriptions on the front, and fold the whole thing into their story. Modern archaeology can tease apart phases, different tool marks, mortar types, joint styles, but for most of history, people weren't doing forensic stratigraphy. They just saw the big old platform under the shiny new temple and associated it with whoever currently ruled the region. Credit follows power, not necessarily the original masons. Renovation also erases fingerprints. Every time a structure gets repaired, expanded, or repurposed, earlier details disappear. Old access ramps are dismantled and recycled. Quarries are recut, obliterating the original extraction surfaces. Working platforms are levelled. Maybe a later builder chisels new levelling courses into the top of a megalithic wall to fit their own, smaller stones. 1,000 years later, what survives as mysterious foundation is actually the last, most durable layer of a whole construction ecosystem. The scaffolding, physical and organisational, was designed to be temporary. Of course it's gone, and even when the people who did the work could have told you exactly how they did it, they usually didn't write it down. Record-keeping in the ancient world is heavily biased. States wrote about kings and victories, gods and rituals, taxes, land and lawsuits. They did not typically write technical manuals for public consumption. Scribal training focused on copying canonical texts, not describing how many men you tied to which rope at which angle of incline. The Egyptians give us tantalizing hints, worker lists, delivery records, quarry notes, but even there, the step-by-step how-to for pyramid construction is absent. It probably existed as practical, embodied knowledge shared on site, not as scrolls filed in a library. So when people say this civilization vanished, what they often mean is, the political brand ended, the big projects stopped, the paperwork didn't survive, the extreme feats weren't repeated in the same way. But that's not the same as a hard reset. More often you get a spectrum, patches of continuity stitched into patches of rupture. A quarry community keeps operating for centuries, even as kingdoms rise and fall around it. Tool sharpening tricks, stone testing methods, preferred grain orientations, those keep being passed down even if the scale of projects shrinks. A conquering empire takes over those quarries, hires the local experts, and blends their methods with its own logistics and aesthetics. A Levantine mason ends up on a Roman payroll. An Anatolian engineer applies Near Eastern ramp logic to a new imperial temple. When you zoom out, you don't see a neat sequence of isolated, vanished cultures. You see streams of technique and habit flowing through time, sometimes dammed, sometimes diverted, sometimes drying up in one valley and reappearing in another. That's why the unknown civilization framing around places like Baalbek is both understandable and misleading. Understandable because the stones really are outrageous, and the written attributions we have skew to later phases. Roman inscriptions, medieval legends, early modern travellers' tales. Misleading because the gap between "we don't have a manual for this" and "this must have been a completely separate, lost people" is huge. It's much more realistic to picture a long-lived local building tradition in the Levant, evolving through Bronze Age city-states, Hellenistic kingdoms, and into the Roman era, techniques refined, downgraded, upscaled, and recombined as money, politics, and fashion allowed. Some bursts of ambition pushed the system to its limits, those monster blocks in the quarry. Later periods never again lined up the same resources and incentives to repeat that exact stunt. So when we ask, where did the know-how go? The answer is, it never really disappears into thin air. It bleeds away when the conditions that made it valuable collapse. It gets folded into new empires and credited under new names. It gets covered over by renovations, edited out by biased record-keeping, and left to be rediscovered by people staring up at impossible walls 2,000 years later, trying to reverse engineer a conversation their ancestors never bothered to write down. And this is where the conversation usually jumps the tracks. Because the moment you have gigantic stones, missing manuals, and blurry historical credit, two kinds of stories rush in to fill the gap. On one side, the ultra-mundane, nothing to see here. It's all just Romans with better paperwork. On the other, the ultra-extraordinary, anti-gravity devices, alien cranes, instant construction with sound waves or crystal lasers. Both feel satisfying in different ways. Neither actually helps us understand what happened on that hillside. Let's start with the greatest hits of the extreme claims. You've heard some version of these. The blocks are too heavy for ropes and rollers, so they must have used anti-gravity or levitation. The precision is too good for hand tools, so they needed advanced machines, lost or extraterrestrial. The scale is so big that it could only have been done in one go almost instantly by some super civilization. All three share the same basic move. I personally can't imagine how this was done. Therefore, it couldn't have been done with anything we know about. That's not evidence. That's inference from personal incredulity. Physics doesn't care if we're impressed. Start with the anti-gravity idea. We know exactly how much a 500, 800, even 1,000-ton block weighs. That's not mysterious. The force you need to lift or move it is just weight multiplied over distance. Nothing about those numbers violates known physics. They're big, but they're not tear a hole in space-time big. Modern cranes and jack-up systems can handle thousands of tons using nothing more exotic than steel, hydraulics and mechanical advantage. The same basic principles you can demonstrate with a stick, a rock, and a fulcrum. Anti-gravity doesn't explain anything. It just replaces a hard logistics problem with a word that sounds cool. Same with alien machinery. If some visiting civilization parked a fleet of supercranes at Baalbek, or handed out matter-disintegrating quarry lasers, you'd expect a whole ecosystem of evidence to go with it. Not just a few big blocks, but metal alloys or residues we can't reproduce, exotic tool marks that don't match fracture mechanics in stone, clear discontinuities in the surrounding culture, sudden leaps in pottery, metalwork, agriculture, everything. Instead, what we see at and around Baalbek lines up with very human signatures. We see chisel marks consistent with iron tools. We see wedge slots, channels for undercutting, evidence of levering. We see styles of masonry that echo other Near Eastern and Mediterranean traditions. Ashlar blocks, drafted margins, polygonal fitting in some cases, but always with tools and techniques within the range of what humans with bronze and iron could produce. Do we know the exact rigging system, the exact ramp layout, the exact workforce schedule by month? No, but that's very different from we see physical effects that cannot be explained by any combination of friction, leverage, and muscle. We don't. This is where that old phrase actually matters. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Saying, this was really hard, and the written records are sparse, is not extraordinary. It's basically the default setting of archaeology. Saying, This required technologies or beings that rewrite physics or human history is extraordinary. To support that, you'd need unambiguous artifacts that don't fit any known tech trajectory, clear, independent lines of evidence converging on the same radical conclusion, explanations that account not just for one site, but for why this incredible tech appears, builds a single platform and then disappears without reshaping everything else. We don't have that. What we do have is an enormous amount of hard but possible. We know humans can move absurd weights with surprisingly simple setups when you throw time and organization at the problem. Medieval cathedral builders lifting multi-ton stones with tread-wheel cranes. Polynesian navigators moving massive basalt slabs from array platforms. Rapa Nui communities walking multi-ton moai statues upright across miles, using ropes and teams pulling in rhythm. Scale those systems up with more people, animals, time, redundant safety margins. Combine that with careful route preparation, packing the soil, building temporary causeways, laying logs or stone ball bearings where needed, and suddenly the 300 to 800 ton range is brutal but not magical. It's like looking at a modern container ship and saying, "No way that floats, it's too big." Our intuition isn't a good guide to engineering. The actual mystery then shifts from could they to how exactly did they choose to? Which brings us to the real unknowns. We don't know the precise order in which every block was quarried, shifted and set. We have plausible sequences, but not a time-lapse. We don't know the full toolkit down to every specialized device. We can infer chisels, levers, rollers, sledges, cranes, ramps, but the exact combination and configuration at Baalbek at each phase, still debated. We don't know the exact timelines for every construction burst. The broader dating is getting better, stone sourcing, mortar analysis, stratigraphy, but there are still arguments about which courses belong to which political era, which repairs mask older phases. Those uncertainties are real. They're not a conspiracy. They're the natural outcome of working with fragmentary evidence. The challenge is, what do we do emotionally with those gaps? One option is to seal them with certainty. This was definitely done by X civilization using Y method at Z date, end of story. Or on the flip side, there's no way anyone back then could have done this. So it must be aliens' lost supertech Atlantean hand-me-downs. Both give you a kind of closure. Both shut down curiosity. A better option is to live in the tension. To say, the stones are undeniably there. The physics is tough but mundane. The cultural context suggests ambitious, well-organized human builders pushing their tech to its limits. Within that, there's room for many different specific solutions, multiple ramp designs, combinations of lifting and sliding, clever uses of groundwater and lubrication, seasonal labor pulses, religious motivations that justified insane resource spending. There's also room for us to be wrong and revise as new data comes in. LiDAR surveys that pick up forgotten access roads, micro-wear analysis on quarry walls revealing new tool types, subsurface radar showing buried construction ramps. These are the kinds of discoveries that actually move the needle, not a new YouTube thumbnail of a block you've already seen 100 times. And here's the irony. When you strip away the need for anti-gravity and alien cranes, what's left is not boring. It's more impressive because now you're not imagining an advanced species flicking a switch on a magic device. You're imagining thousands of ordinary people bound by religion and politics and pay, moving through a landscape of dust and sweat, coordinating their muscles and their knowledge to do something at the absolute edge of what's possible with stone, wood, rope and iron. You're imagining foremen arguing over rope thickness, priests insisting a cornerstone be aligned to a star, engineers recalculating the angle of a ramp because last year's flood washed out part of the hillside. You're imagining an entire society bending itself around a building problem for years. Allowing for that level of human grit and ingenuity doesn't kill the mystery. It anchors it. It takes the wonder you feel staring at those stones and connects it to real questions. What tricks did they know that we've forgotten? How did they test safety without modern math? How far were they willing to push labour and risk for a god, a king, or a calendar? Those are mysteries we can actually work on. Curiosity, guided by evidence, is slower than certainty. It doesn't give you a clean, tight origin story with a single dramatic twist. But it does something much more powerful. It turns places like Baalbek from props in someone's favourite theory into active laboratories for understanding how humans, people like us, solve impossible problems, lose the solutions, and then try to rediscover them by reading stone like a palimpsest. And if we keep that mindset the next time a new survey comes out or a buried ramp shows up under a collapsed wall, we won't be disappointed that it's just more ropes and levers. We'll recognise it for what it is, another piece of a very human puzzle, still incomplete, still astonishing, and still very much worth the effort of figuring out. If you've stayed with me this far, you're exactly the kind of person I wrote something for. Quick middle break, then we're diving straight back into ropes, ramps, and experiments. I put together a book on 12 of the strangest, most stubbornly unresolved cases in archaeology and ancient history. Not just Baalbek, but things like the sudden appearance of perfectly planned cities where we'd only expect scattered villages, megalithic sites with astronomical alignments that seem almost over-engineered for the naked eye, cultures that mastered one insanely complex technology and then walked away from it. It's not a compilation of wild claims. It's the opposite. For each mystery I walk through, what we actually know, what's been proposed, what the evidence supports, and where the data simply runs out. If you're the kind of person who likes sitting in that uncomfortable space between this is definitely false and we really don't know yet, that book lives there. You can grab it on the website, there's a link in the description. And this week there's a discount running for viewers of this channel. If you want a deeper dive into 12 puzzles like Baalbek, with sources you can actually chase down, that's where to find it. Alright, back to the stones. Because once you accept that we're not waiting for alien cranes to show up, you're left with a much more interesting challenge. How do we test any of this? A story about sledges and ramps is just that, a story until someone tries to drag a ridiculous block of stone with a ridiculous number of people and measures what happens. This is where experimental archaeology comes in. Instead of imagining, maybe they used logs, or maybe they used stone rollers, or maybe they flooded the path and slid it like a bar of soap, you pick one method and build it as close as you reasonably can. You quarry a block, not 800 tons, that would bankrupt a university, but 10 tons, 20 tons, 50 tons, if you can get the budget and the insurance. You carve it with replica tools. You rig it with replica ropes. You lay out a ramp or a prepared track. Then you pull. And suddenly, the debate changes. Because now you have numbers. How many people can actually move a stone of that size on a packed dirt ramp with wooden sledges? How much faster does it go if you wet the ground? What's the failure point for the rope? What happens when you hit even a small bump in the terrain? You also find out what breaks catastrophically long before the stone moves an inch. Archaeologists and engineers have already run some of these tests at other sites. We've seen teams move multi-ton blocks on sledges, discovering, for example, that a thin layer of water on sand can cut friction dramatically, but too much turns it into a bog. We've watched walking statues tip and rock forward, with surprisingly little force when ropes are pulled in rhythm. We've tested simple wooden cranes and counterweight systems that can lift astonishing loads, as long as you respect the limits. None of these reconstructions are perfect copies of what happened in the past. They can't be. Our labour conditions are different. Our wood isn't quite the same. Our health and diet and risk tolerance aren't theirs. But they do something incredibly important. They carve away the impossible. If a given method fails miserably even at 1/10th scale, under ideal conditions, you can be pretty sure it wasn't the primary solution for moving a block 10 times larger over rough terrain. If a method works shockingly well, if a team of 80 people can move a 20-ton stone at a walking pace with simple gear, then suddenly the idea of 400 people moving a 200-ton block doesn't sound like fantasy. It sounds like a logistics headache, but a solvable one. That's the real power of experimental archaeology. It doesn't tell you this is exactly what they did, but it can tell you this class of solutions probably works. This class of solutions is probably a dead end. And when you pair that with what we actually see carved into the landscape, quarry scars, half-freed blocks, abandoned ramps, you start narrowing the field. The same goes for lifting and setting. We can build scale models of lifting towers, capstan-driven winches, counterweight boxes, and multi-stage jacking systems. We can stack blocks on prepared pads, then try to nudge them into final position with incremental lifts and shims. We can map the stress on ropes and beams and joints and see what fails first. But experiments don't exist in a vacuum. If you don't pair them with data from the real site, you're just playing ancient construction fantasy camp. That's where modern surveys come in. High-resolution 3D scanning, drone photogrammetry, ground-penetrating radar, microgravity surveys, even subtle variations in the Earth's magnetic field. These tools are letting researchers peel back the skin of sites like Baalbek without digging a single trench. You can detect buried ramp structures. You can trace old quarry roads now covered by later buildings. You can see whether the foundations of those gigantic blocks sit on carefully prepared terraces or rough bedrock. You can even pick up tiny differences in block dimensions and joint geometry that hint at different construction teams or phases. Combine that with experimental tests, and suddenly you're not just guessing maybe there was a ramp here. You're saying, the scan shows a linear anomaly under this slope that looks like fill. Our model ramp with that angle and that fill type can support X tons pulled by Y workers. That lines up with the size of the blocks above. This configuration is plausible in the real world under real forces. It still doesn't give you certainty. It gives you a corridor of realism. Inside that corridor, methods that work with known materials, known physics and human muscle. Outside it, ideas that are fun to say but collapse the moment you measure them. In the next sections, we're going to live inside that corridor. We'll look at actual experiments where people tried to move and lift absurd stones with replica tools and see what succeeded, what failed, and what surprised everyone. Then we'll bring in the modern tech, laser scans, subsurface surveys, and microanalysis of tool marks to see what the stones at Baalbek themselves are telling us about the methods used. Because the real test of any theory isn't how cinematic it sounds. It's whether it survives contact with rock, rope, and gravity. So let's zoom in on that idea. Experimental archaeology sounds fancy, but the core is simple. You stop arguing in the abstract and you start building things until something breaks. You take one hypothesis about how ancient builders might have moved or lifted heavy stones. You strip it down to its essential components, and you try it under controlled conditions. Then you write down what happens in painful detail. Over the past few decades, people have done this with almost every classic megalithic solution you've heard of. Sledges dragged over packed earth, logs used as rollers. Stones walked upright with ropes, levers ratcheting a block up step by step. Simple cranes powered by humans walking in circles around a capstan. Each of these ideas sounds good in a diagram, Experimental archaeology is what happens when you stop looking at the diagram and start sweating. Take sledges. Multiple teams have shown that you can move stones in the 10 to 30 ton range over short distances using nothing but wooden sledges, ropes, and human muscle. If you prepare the ground, clear it, pack it, sometimes lay wooden planks, and you keep the load on a reasonably shallow slope, people can drag a surprising amount of weight. Vary one thing at a time, and the picture sharpens. Dry sand. The sled cuts in, friction skyrockets, and everyone hates their life. Slightly damp sand. Suddenly the same crew can move the same load with half the effort. Too much water. The path turns to sludge, and you're right back where you started. Those experiments give you numbers, coefficients of friction. Pulling forces per person. The slope at which everything stops moving, and the point at which ropes start failing. Not guesses, measurements. Rollers tell a different story. When you put a block on top of wooden rollers on a nice level surface, it looks and feels great. There's very little resistance once it's moving. But the moment the terrain gets uneven, or the rollers start crushing under the load, or they pop out from under one side, you discover the hidden cost, roller management. You now need a whole team just to shuttle logs from the back to the front, to keep them aligned, to replace the ones that splinter. Experiments show it can work well for medium weights over controlled paths, and falls apart fast when the loads and distances scale up without serious planning and a lot of spare timber. Then there's walking. If you've ever seen those reconstructions of statues being rocked forward upright with ropes, that's not CGI. Teams have actually done it, with carefully tied ropes, a controlled centre of gravity, and a rhythmic pull. Small groups have moved multi-ton monoliths at a slow walking pace without laying a single roller or plank. You learn that stability is everything. A tiny misalignment or a slightly steeper slope, and your elegant walking statue turns into an elegant faceplant. Again, the experiment doesn't prove that every ancient culture used this method, but it proves that under the right conditions, you don't need a low-friction highway to move a dressed stone. For lifting, experiments with levers and jacks are even more counterintuitive. Give a crew enough long wooden beams and sturdy cribbing, stacks of smaller blocks or timbers, and they can lift a huge stone, not by hoisting it in one heroic motion, but by inches. Lever one side up, shove something under it, move to the other side, repeat. Step by step, the stone climbs onto a higher platform. Simple capstan systems add another layer. Connect ropes to a load, wind them around a vertical post, and have people walk in a circle. The capstan multiplies their force, and suddenly a team that could barely drag a stone in a straight line can lift one end of it off the ground. Recreate this with replica posts, period-appropriate rope, and conservative safety margins, and you find that safe lifting capacities are much higher than you'd expect if your wood, your joinery, and your anchoring points are all up to the task. But here's where reality bites. All of these experiments are almost always done at relatively small scales. A few tons, maybe a few dozen. Enough to be impressive, not enough to kill everyone if something fails. That's the scaling problem. Physics doesn't care that you're recreating a noble ancient technology. When you jump from 20 tons to 200 tons, you're not just adding a zero to the weight, you're jumping into a different regime. Stress on materials doesn't scale in a friendly, linear way. The cross-section of your timber beams has to grow much faster than the weight if you want to keep the same safety margin. Rope that is perfectly adequate at 10 tons might snap catastrophically at 50, not because the number is higher, but because small flaws get amplified under higher loads. Friction changes character too. A 10-ton block on a sledge will deform the soil a bit. A 200-ton block ploughs it. Your carefully prepared road becomes a trench. Suddenly, you're not just overcoming sliding friction. You're constantly climbing out of the rut you're digging with every centimetre you move. Even manpower scales awkwardly. You can't just say if 100 people can move 20 tons, 1,000 people can move 200 tons. There's only so much room around a rope or a sled, past a certain point. Extra people are literally standing there with nothing to hold on to, breathing hard and contributing very little. You have to start thinking in terms of multiple teams, multiple rope lines, staggered pulls, and the coordination needed so they don't interfere with each other. Experimental archaeology forces you to confront those limits, because you can measure them. You can record exactly how many newtons of force each rope line can handle before the fibres start to fail. You can test different rope materials, plant fibres, leather, twisted hair, and see which combination gives the best balance of strength, stretch, and durability. You can track the surface preparation of the road, packed earth versus gravel fill versus wooden trackways. You can calculate how much fill you'd need to build a ramp of a certain slope, and how often it would need maintenance once heavy loads start chewing it up. You can time how long a crew can pull at a given exertion level before exhaustion sets in, then plug that into a simple schedule, work cycles, rest cycles, total distance per day. By the time you're done, your "they just dragged it" story has turned into a spreadsheet full of manpower estimates, rope inventories, and cubic meters of rammed earth. This is where the method shows its double edge. On the one hand, the experiments strongly support certain classes of solutions. We know that human crews can and do move multi-ton blocks with sledges on prepared paths. Slight adjustments like wetting sand or using planks change performance by measurable, repeatable amounts. Laver and cribbing systems can lift heavy stones in increments without advanced metallurgy. Simple capstan and pulley systems built from wood and fibre can multiply human effort enough to hoist serious loads. On the other hand, when you try to stretch those same techniques directly to something like Baalbek's biggest blocks, the numbers start to scream. The forces approach the breaking strength of any plausible rope you can make from local plants. The timber sizes you'd need for some ramp or crane designs become absurd, especially in a region where large straight trees are not exactly overflowing. The amount of fill for certain proposed ramps runs into millions of cubic meters, which would leave unmistakable scars on the landscape. So the experiments tell us two very different things at once. First, Stone Age physics is absolutely capable of moving and lifting stones far larger than most people assume, as long as you control the conditions. Second, you can't lazily scale up any one trick and expect it to explain everything from a 10-ton lintel to an 800-ton foundation block. There's still a speculative zone. We don't yet have a full-scale reconstruction of a Baalbek-class operation. No one has cut, dragged and set an 800-ton stone using only historically plausible tools and methods. The cost, the risk, and the environmental impact make that kind of test unlikely anytime soon. So we live between two poles. On one side, firmly supported principles. Friction behaves this way. Rope breaks at that load. A given crew can produce roughly this much pulling force for this long. These are grounded in experiments. On the other side, specific reconstructions for specific sites. The ramp probably went here. This many teams could have handled that block, that still rest on modelling and inference. Experimental archaeology doesn't close the case. It narrows the options. It lets us say with some confidence they didn't need lost technologies or impossible machines, while still admitting we don't yet know the exact combination of ramps, levers, and clever sequencing they used at this particular place. And that's where Baalbek becomes interesting again. Because now the question isn't, could humans even do this? The experiments say yes within certain bounds. The question is, what do the specific stones and scars at Baalbek tell us about which combination of human tricks they actually chose? For that, we have to listen closely to the site itself, through surveys, scans and microscopic clues carved right into the rock. So let's do that. Let's listen. Modern archaeology's biggest leap isn't that we suddenly got smarter. It's that we got better ears. Instead of just standing in front of a wall and arguing about it, we can now wrap the entire hill in sensors, fly over it with lasers and peel back the ground layer by layer on a computer screen without moving a single grain of soil. Start with LiDAR. Fire millions of laser pulses from a drone or plane. Measure how long each one takes to bounce back, and you get a three-dimensional model of the landscape so detailed you can see faint terraces, buried ramp traces and long-eroded quarry scars. At Baalbek and other megalithic sites, LiDAR can reveal subtle breaks in slope that don't look like much on the ground, but line up beautifully if you're thinking about logistics, where a ramp might have run, where a workyard might have sat, where an access road may have once cut across the hillside. Then there's photogrammetry. Take hundreds or thousands of overlapping high-resolution photos from different angles, feed them into software, and it reconstructs the surfaces in 3D with sub-millimeter precision. Suddenly, a block face that looks smooth to your eyes turns into a landscape of tiny ridges, chips, and grooves. You can walk along the side of a Trilithon stone at 10:1 scale on your laptop, tilt the light, and see patterns emerge. Long, shallow striations all running in one direction, or clustered peck marks grouped in patches. You can compare those patterns across blocks. One set of stones shows a consistent signature, same rhythm of hits, same direction of drag marks. Another set in the same wall shows a distinctly different pattern, deeper cuts, sharper corners, a different rhythm. That's how you start to separate phases. Not by saying this looks older, but by saying these blocks were shaped with one family of tools and techniques, those with another. That doesn't automatically tell you the date, but it tells you the sequence. The same thing happens when you zoom even further in. Under magnification, tool marks become microscopic canyons. The edges are either crisp or rounded, the micro-chipping around a groove either chaotic or strangely regular. A steel chisel leaves a different micro-fracture pattern than a hard stone hammer. A toothed Roman chisel tends to create parallel ridges. A pounding with dolerite balls leaves dense fields of small impact craters. Micro-wear analysis, looking at how those tiny fractures have weathered, can even tell you whether the surface stayed exposed, was covered, or was reworked later. So when someone says, "This whole platform is one single mysterious phase," the stone can quietly disagree. It can say, "No. This face was roughed out with pounding tools, then later trimmed with metal chisels along the edges. This block sat partially buried for some time, then had a new joint cut when the wall was modified." Those are the kinds of details that let you argue with some restraint for pre-Roman groundwork and Roman refacing in certain areas, instead of imagining a monolithic single-moment build. Geology adds another voice. By mapping the stone types at the site and matching them to specific layers in nearby quarries, you can reconstruct supply chains that are otherwise invisible. At Baalbek, some of the biggest blocks are clearly local limestone, but local isn't enough. The quarry face is made of multiple beds, each with slightly different colour, fossil content or impurity pattern. Thin section petrography, slicing off a sliver of stone and looking at it under polarised light, lets geologists say, "This block came from that particular bed, not the one above it." If the Trilithon blocks and the massive unfinished stones in the quarry match the same bed, that ties them together as a single quarrying episode, or at least a tightly related campaign. If other, smaller blocks in the same temple come from different beds or even different quarries, you can start to see construction in waves. First, the colossal foundations from one layer, then later additions from another, then patchwork repairs drawing from whatever was convenient. ground-penetrating radar pushes that logic below the surface. GPR sends electromagnetic pulses into the ground and listens for reflections from buried features, walls, cavities, changes in soil. Run systematic grids over the platform and its surroundings, and you can see whether there are voids under certain blocks, filled ramp tunnels, or hidden retaining walls behind what looks like a simple face. Combine that with seismic surveys, small controlled vibrations measured by arrays of sensors, and you get a sense of how the whole massif behaves as a single structure. That's crucial, because with stones this big mass and geometry aren't just cosmetic. They're structural strategy. A 700-ton block isn't just impressive. Its sheer weight pins the wall into the hill, resists outward thrust, and changes how earthquakes travel through the building. Seismic modelling lets engineers test scenarios. What happens when a lateral wave hits this platform? Does the Trilithon layer act as a single bonded unit, or do the joints act as fracture lines? Do the enormous stones reduce stress on the courses above by evening out vibrations, or do they concentrate it? If your model shows that the current arrangement is unusually stable in the local seismic context, that hints that the builders, or at least the final designers, understood, empirically if not mathematically, how to stack mass and shape to ride out the Earth's shaking. And all of this, the scans, the micro marks, the quarry matches, the stress maps, feeds into a new generation of questions. Not the old "could humans even do this?" but which exact surfaces of the Trilithon blocks were ever exposed for tooling, and which were always buried? Are there abandoned starter cuts for ramps or lifting pockets hidden behind later masonry? Do tool mark signatures shift gradually up the wall, suggesting continuous local tradition, or abruptly at certain courses, suggesting a change of workforce or technology? Can we find systematic differences in stone sourcing between what look like mysterious megalithic courses and clearly Roman ones? And structurally, are the biggest stones actually necessary for stability, or are they overkill, meaning there might have been other motivations for going that big? These are the frontier questions at places like Baalbek right now. They don't make the mystery go away. If anything, they sharpen it. Because the more clearly we can hear what the stones are saying, the more precisely we can see just how much skill, planning, and accumulated knowledge it took to carve, move, and lock them into the earth, without any of the machines we take for granted today. So where does all of this leave us? Strip away the hype, the memes, the ancient mystery cult thumbnails, and a few solid things remain standing. We know the stones at Baalbek, including the Trilithon and the truly gigantic unfinished blocks in the quarry, are local. They come from identifiable beds of limestone just up the slope. We're not looking at alien imports or vanished supermaterials. We're looking at people using the heaviest usable stone right under their feet. We know from quarry scars and half-finished blocks that the basic methods were human scale: cut channels, undercut, leave nubs and ridges for leverage, then detach. No laser gloss, just thousands of hits from hammers and chisels, plus a very clear understanding of where each fracture would run. We know that transporting blocks in the 300-800 ton range is possible with pre-industrial technology, not because someone on the internet feels it is, but because experiments, historical cranes and other sites show us the toolkit: packed earthen ramps, rollers and sledges, traction with huge teams of workers and animals, and smart use of gravity wherever you can steal it. We know from tool marks, mortar lines and masonry styles that Baalbek is not a single moment miracle. It's a hill that has been reworked, expanded and refaced across centuries. At least one substantial pre-Roman phase is almost certainly there in the deep foundation courses. Roman engineers then arrive, plug into that existing stone platform, and go wild with their own technology and aesthetics on top. So when people say an unknown civilization built this, the answer is it probably wasn't a lost global superculture. It was more likely local or regional groups, Bronze Age or even earlier, standing in a long chain of continuity, quarrying and building with stone because their parents did, and their grandparents did, and the bedrock was teaching them what worked. But there are still gaps, big ones. We don't have a clean, uncontested construction sequence that everyone agrees on for every massive block. We don't know the exact organisation of labour. Were these seasonal village projects, royal campaigns, cult centres managed over generations? We don't have the complete ramp systems or the full lifting rigs preserved in stone the way we'd like. We don't know why, out of all the sizes they could have chosen, someone decided that blocks in the 700 to 1,000 ton range were worth the extra agony. Structural logic explains part of it, but maybe not all of it. Status, ritual, tradition, a particular engineer with a taste for overkill. We're still guessing. We don't know the full story of how the know-how faded. Was it a sudden political collapse? A slow reorientation toward different building materials? A shift in trade networks that made smaller, modular construction more practical? The stones hint, but they don't narrate, and that's why this still matters. Because every time we tighten one screw in the story, match one more block to a quarry bed, decode one more family of tool marks, we're reminded that complexity, planning, and deep engineering intuition are not modern inventions. They're human inventions, old, fragile, and easy to lose. The mystery isn't that ancient people were too primitive to do this. The mystery is how many layers of trial and error, apprenticeship, and shared memory had to pile up before a community could look at a 1,000-ton block and say, yeah, let's try it. If you want to dive deeper into this kind of deep time detective work, I've put together a book on 12 prehistoric secrets, sites and puzzles that rewrite what we think we know about early engineering and culture. You can read more about it and grab a copy through the link on my website in the description. If you found this exploration of Baalbek and its vanishing builders thought-provoking, it really helps the channel if you tap like, subscribe if you haven't already, and share your thoughts in the comments. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Drop your country or city below, and let's see just how far the descendants of stone movers have spread.